The air inside the Zarathian training arena was thick with heat and the scent of charged metal. The walls, forged from dark polished stone, pulsed with faint streaks of bioluminescent veins, living conduits that carried energy throughout the stronghold. Overhead, massive banners depicting the twin blades of House HYF swayed in an unseen current, watching over the assembled warriors like silent sentinels. At the center of the circular chamber, under the gaze of at least 50 elite fighters, stood a human. Callum exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders to loosen the stiffness in his muscles. The weight of dozens of golden eyes pressed down on him, but he was used to being watched, evaluated, underestimated, tested. This wasn't the first time he had stepped into a ring surrounded by doubters, and it wouldn't be the last. Across from him stood his opponent, Zyrov, the Zarithian warrior caste. Her sapphire mule skin glistened under the harsh glow of the overhead lights, a sheen of warmth settling over the sharp contours of her physique. Like all Zarathians, her body was a blend of grace and durability, her natural exoskeletal plating forming protective ridges along her arms, shoulders, and thighs. Her short, jet-black hair framed an angular face marked by sharp, predatory features, intense golden eyes that gleamed with amusement and condescension. She wasn't just any fighter. She was one of the most renowned warriors of her generation, trained in the ruthless HYF combat discipline from childhood. And she had made her thoughts on humans painfully clear. She took a step forward, the movement fluid, effortless, confident. "So," she said, voice smooth as a blade sliding from its sheath, "this is the great human warrior we've heard so much about." A murmur rippled through the gathered Zarithians, hushed laughter barely restrained. They didn't bother hiding their amusement. Callum didn't react. He had expected this. Zarithians, a proud and militaristic species, had dominated their corner of the galaxy for centuries. Their warriors were born to fight, trained to see battle as both an art and a duty. In their eyes, humans were flesh-bound creatures lacking the natural armor, superior speed, or enhanced biology needed to be considered true warriors. Humans were adaptable, yes, cunning, maybe, but in raw combat, they were fragile. And yet, here he was, standing in the center of a HYF battle arena, preparing to face one of their own in a trial by combat. He wasn't here for sport. This was a test. Earth's military alliance had been in negotiations with the Zarithian High Command for nearly a year, trying to earn their respect. And, more importantly, their alliance. The Zarithians refused to acknowledge any species as equals unless they proved themselves in combat. That was how their society worked. Diplomacy was secondary, strength came first. Which meant that Callum's victory or failure here could determine the fate of Earth's standing among them. No pressure. Zyra smirked, folding her arms across her chest. "Tell me, human," she drawled, "how do you plan to fight when you can barely move in that ridiculous armor?" Callum met her gaze, then deliberately let his eyes drift around the room, the warriors watching. The way they whispered to each other, their postures relaxed, as if the outcome had already been decided. He exhaled sharply through his nose. "Fine," he said, "let's make this fair." And then, before she could react, he unclasped the locks of his armor. A dull clang echoed through the chamber as the heavy plating fell to the ground. Another, then another, until nothing remained but the fitted combat fabric stretched over his torso, doing little to hide the sheer physicality beneath. The room went silent. Zyra's smirk remained, but her fingers twitched slightly at her sides. She hadn't expected that. Her people had always spoken of humans as fragile, but the man standing before her was anything but. Broad shoulders, defined muscle, a chest lined with the faint traces of old scars. Proof that he had survived battles even her kind might not have walked away from. Strength earned, not given. She hated that her gaze lingered. Hated even more that something inside her stirred at the sight. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing. With an arched brow, she rolled her shoulders, feigning disinterest. "Hoping to impress me?" Callum smirked, stretching his arms lazily. "Nah, just figured I'd give you a fighting chance." A sharp hiss of amusement rippled through the gathered Zerithians, more out of shock than anything else. The arrogance of it, the audacity. For the first time, Zyra felt a flicker of curiosity beneath her usual disdain. Humans were supposed to fear Zerithian warriors. Yet Callum stood before her, unarmored, surrounded by her people, and he was still smiling. Fascinating. She took a step forward, lowering her stance. The time for words was over. She would end this quickly. The moment the battle horn sounded, she lunged. And Callum moved, not just with skill, but with speed. Zyra barely had time to react as he pivoted, sidestepping her strike with an ease that sent a flash of irritation down her spine. Humans weren't supposed to be this fast. Her next attack came sharper, more precise, aimed at his center mass. He ducked, countered, and suddenly he was inside her guard, too close. She felt the heat radiating off him, the tension in his frame, the raw efficiency of his movement, not wild, not desperate, calculated, controlled. "You were saying," he murmured. Her jaw tightened. This was not going to be as easy as she thought. She leapt back, resetting her stance, golden eyes narrowing. For the first time in her life, she had the slightest sliver of doubt. And that infuriated her. The fight had only just begun, and already she had one undeniable thought lodged in her mind. This human was not what she expected. And for some reason she couldn't stop wanting to look at him. The jungle moon of Sivaris was alive. It breathed in the way only true wilderness could, its towering obsidian trees whispering in the wind, their bioluminescent veins pulsing with eerie green light. The ground was damp beneath Callum's boots, thick with gnarled roots and alien flora that released faint streams of vapor when disturbed. The air smelled of damp earth, minerals, and something sharp and metallic that Callum couldn't quite place. This world was dangerous. Callum had read the briefings before coming here. Sivaris was a proving ground, a jungle untouched by civilization, teeming with creatures that could kill even the strongest warrior in an instant. The Zerithians used it for their most brutal survival tests, a rite of passage for those seeking to earn the title of true warriors. He hadn't expected to be here so soon. The duel with Zyra should have been the end of it. He had stepped into the Kioreth battle arena expecting a simple fight, a chance to prove that humans weren't as weak as the Zerithians believed. He had walked out victorious, but instead of granting him their respect, they had sent him here. "Strength in the arena means nothing," one of their elders had told him. "If you want to stand among us, you must first stand against Sivaris." Which is how he found himself here, deep in the jungle, alongside the very woman he had fought only days ago. Zyra moved ahead of him, silent as a shadow, her sapphire buhl skin blending into the faint glow of the foliage. She was fast, precise, every step deliberate. Callum wasn't sure if she had been sent here to guide him or to watch him fail. Maybe both. He was keeping up with her, though, and from the occasional glance she threw his way, he could tell it annoyed her. He smirked to himself. Good. They had been walking for hours, tracking something, though what exactly Callum hadn't been told. The Zerithians weren't the type to explain themselves to outsiders. They expected him to follow, to keep up, to prove himself without complaint. The first sign of danger came subtly. A faint shift in the air, the sudden stillness of the jungle, the way Zyra's posture changed, shoulders tensing ever so slightly. Then came the growl. Low, deep, vibrating through the trees like a warning. Callum's grip tightened around his combat knife, his heartbeat slowing, steadying. Predator. Close. Zyra's hand shot up in a silent signal. Stop. Callum obeyed without hesitation. He wasn't foolish enough to ignore her instincts. If she sensed something was wrong, it was wrong. A second growl rumbled through the air, closer this time. The HYF struck without warning. It came from the trees, a massive six-legged beast with obsidian-black skin that shimmered like polished stone, its bioluminescent red eyes locking onto its prey. Its elongated limbs were built for speed, its curved talons for the kill. Zyra moved first. She was already airborne by the time the HYF lunged, her twin daggers flashing in the dim light. She twisted mid-air, aiming for its neck, but the beast was faster than she had anticipated. It swiped upward with one massive claw, catching her mid-air. She barely managed to twist away, landing in a crouch, but the creature was already pivoting, its fanged maw snapping toward her. Callum didn't hesitate. He moved, fast and fluid, closing the distance in a blink. His blade was in his hand before he even registered drawing it, his muscles already shifting into action. The HYF saw him at the last second and turned up too late. Callum dropped low, sliding beneath its lunging form and driving his blade upward in one smooth motion. The energized edge sliced through the creature's underside, black blood spraying across the jungle floor. The beast shrieked, its movements faltering. Zyra took the opening. She surged forward, one dagger flashing toward its glowing throat, a single, precise strike. The HYF collapsed, dead before it hit the ground. Silence settled over the jungle once more, thick and heavy. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, only the sound of their breathing filling the space between them. Then, finally, Zyra exhaled, standing to her full height. She yanked her dagger free from the beast's neck, flicking the black blood from the blade with practiced ease. When she turned to Callum, something flickered in her golden eyes. "You fight well," she admitted. Callum wiped his blade on his sleeve, sheathing it at his side. "You say that like you're surprised." She arched a brow. "I am," he smirked. "I should be offended." Zyra tilted her head slightly, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. He wondered what exactly she was looking for. Weakness, hesitation, a sign that he had just gotten lucky? But he hadn't, and she knew it. "This jungle will kill you if you're not careful," she finally said. "Keep up, human." Then she turned and continued walking. Callum watched her go for half a second before following. There was no trail, no path to follow, just the endless breathing jungle and whatever waited for them in the shadows. He had won the duel, but this was the real test. And somehow he had the feeling that Zyra was part of it. The fire flickered between them, casting jagged shadows against the jungle's twisted roots and towering trees. The air smelled of charred wood, damp earth, and the faint lingering metallic tang of HYF blood. The battle had been won, but Sivaris was never truly safe. Zyra sat with her back against a massive tree, one leg stretched out, the other bent at the knee. She was cleaning her dagger with slow, methodical strokes, her golden eyes flickering in the dim light. Across from her, Callum sat on a fallen log, rolling his shoulders as he checked his gear. They hadn't spoken much since the fight. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Zyra hated that she kept glancing at him, that she was aware of him in a way she hadn't been before. He had moved with her in battle as if they had trained together for years. Every counter, every strike, perfectly timed. The way he had stepped between her and the HYF's claws without hesitation, as if her survival was instinctive to him. She had underestimated him, and that irritated her. Callum exhaled, stretching his arms over his head. The firelight played over his skin, highlighting the sharp lines of his muscles, the old scars that marked his body like a map of past battles. Zyra had been trained to analyze an opponent's weaknesses, to assess their physical form for advantages in combat, but this wasn't the same. This was different. She dragged her gaze away before he could catch her looking. Callum didn't miss much, though. "You've been quiet," he said. His voice was low, steady, not a challenge, just an observation. Zyra flicked her blade in her hand, testing its balance. "I don't talk just to fill the air like humans do." Callum smirked, shaking his head. No, I guess you don't. Silence stretched between them again, broken only by the distant hum of nocturnal creatures hidden in the jungle. Then, after a moment, Callum leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. What do you fight? Zyra stilled. Her grip on the dagger tightened for half a second before she forced herself to relax. She could have given him the answer she always gave, because it was her duty, because it was what she was born to do, but the words felt hollow in her throat. Instead, she tilted her head, studying him. And you? Why do you fight, human? Callum let out a slow breath, gaze fixed on the fire. Because I have to. Zyra arched a brow. That's not an answer. His lips quirked in amusement, but there was something else in his expression, something heavier. I fight because if I don't, someone else has to. Someone who might not be strong enough. Someone who might not come back. Zyra frowned slightly. She hadn't expected an answer like that. She had thought humans fought out of desperation, out of fear. But there was no fear in his voice, only a quiet, unshakable certainty. For a moment she thought of the warriors she had lost, the ones who had fallen beside her, the ones she hadn't been able to save. Maybe humans weren't so different after all. She shifted, wincing as a sharp sting lanced through her shoulder. Callum's eyes snapped to her immediately. "You're hurt," he said. "It's nothing." Callum didn't look convinced. In one smooth motion he stood and crossed the space between them. Zyra stiffened as he crouched beside her, closer than she expected. She could feel the heat of him, the steady strength beneath his skin. He reached for her arm but hesitated, his fingers hovering just above her shoulder. "May I?" The question threw her off. Warriors didn't ask. They took what they needed. They did what had to be done. She gave a short nod. His touch was warm, firm, but careful as he pulled her armor back just enough to see the wound. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding sluggishly. His fingers brushed against her skin as he inspected it, and she felt something she couldn't quite name coil in her stomach. "You need this bandaged," he murmured. "Alive?" He huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, but maybe let's not test how much blood you can lose in one night." Zyra wanted to say something sharp, something dismissive, but the words didn't come because he was too focused on the way his hands moved, practical, steady, and yet gentle. She had never thought humans were weak, not really, but she had never considered that their strength could be this. Not brute force, not speed, but something quieter, something unyielding. She let him work, let him wrap the bandage around her arm, securing it with a practiced ease that told her he had done this before, probably too many times. His fingers brushed against her skin once more before he pulled back, and for the first time in her life, Zyra had the ridiculous urge to reach out and pull him back. She crushed the thought before it could take root. Callum sat back on his heels, looking up at her with something unreadable in his gaze. "There. Not so bad, right?" Zyra exhaled, forcing herself to look unimpressed. "You're surprisingly competent, human." He smirked. "And you're surprisingly bad at saying thank you." She scoffed, shaking her head, but there was no real heat behind it. Callum pushed himself up and returned to his side of the fire, stretching out on the log as if nothing had happened, as if the air between them hadn't just shifted in a way Zyra didn't know how to deal with. She watched him for a long moment, then turned her gaze back to the flames. She told herself it meant nothing, and yet when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the warmth of his hands on her skin. The rain came in a relentless torrent, a wall of water that swallowed the jungle whole. The sky had been heavy with warning for hours, thick with the scent of an approaching storm, but when it finally broke, it was with fury. Wind howled through the trees, whipping through the dense undergrowth and rattling the massive leaves overhead. The jungle floor had already turned to thick, clinging mud, and with each step the ground threatened to pull them down, making progress impossible. Zyra cursed under her breath as the rain drenched her to the bone. This was not how the night was supposed to go. "Move!" she barked, barely glancing over her shoulder as she pushed forward. Callum was right behind her, his breathing steady despite the struggle. She had expected the terrain to slow him down, but he moved with the same damn stubbornness he always did, matching her pace step for step. Another gust of wind howled through the trees, and she knew they couldn't keep going like this. They needed shelter. Fast. Then she spotted it. A jagged rock formation jutting out from the side of a cliff, its mouth partially hidden behind thick vines. It wasn't perfect, but it was dry. "There!" she shouted, breaking into a sprint. By the time they reached the outcrop, the storm was in full force. The moment they ducked inside, the downpour blurred the world beyond into a curtain of gray, the sound of rain hitting the stone deafening. Zyra ran a hand through her dripping hair, shaking off the cold as she took a quick assessment of their surroundings. The space was small, just enough for them to sit comfortably, the stone walls rough but solid. No signs of predators, no immediate threats. Just them. Callum exhaled as he leaned against the wall, reaching up to squeeze the water from his soaked shirt. And that's when she made the mistake of looking. The firelight had hidden things before. The dim glow of embers had softened the edges, let her pretend she hadn't noticed too much. But now, in the sharp light of the storm, she saw everything. The way the wet fabric clung to him, outlining every inch of muscle beneath. The way his chest rose and fell in steady, controlled breaths. The way water dripped from his jaw, trailing down his neck before disappearing beneath his collar. Something tightened in her stomach and she hated it. She had spent her life believing humans were weak, fragile things. She had wanted him to be that. Wanted him to fit into the neat little box she had placed his kind in. But Callum had shattered every expectation, every assumption, every carefully built wall she had constructed around herself. And the worst part? She couldn't stop looking at him. Zyra turned away sharply, focusing on the cave wall, angry at herself for even letting the thought linger. Callum smirked, as if he could feel her frustration. "You're quiet," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the storm. She scowled. "Maybe I just have nothing worth saying." He chuckled, rolling his shoulders. That'd be a first. The familiar tug of irritation was almost comforting, something normal, something she understood. But even as she grasped for it, her focus betrayed her, drawn back to the way his shirt stuck to his skin, to the way his hair had been plastered to his forehead, darkened by rain. She needed a distraction, anything. Then, as if the universe was answering her unspoken plea, Callum shifted and winced. It was barely noticeable, a flicker of tension in his jaw, a slight tightening of his muscles, but she caught it instantly. "You're hurt," she said, standing before she even realized she was moving. Callum sighed. "It's nothing." Zyra was already kneeling in front of him, too close, her instincts taking over. "You're terrible at lying." His smirk didn't quite reach his eyes this time. "I'm fine." She grabbed his arm before he could protest, ignoring the way heat sparked across her skin the moment she touched him. His sleeve was soaked, clinging to his bicep, but when she pushed it up, she saw the wound. A deep gash, still bleeding sluggishly. Her jaw tightened. "And you weren't going to mention this?" Callum exhaled through his nose. "I was going to get around to it." She huffed, reaching for her pack. He chuckled. "He wound me." She already had a wound to deal with, and she wasn't in the mood for his sarcasm. She pulled out a cloth, soaked it with water from her canister and pressed it against the injury. Callum barely flinched. That bothered her more than it should have. A wound like this should hurt, it should elicit a reaction, but he just watched her, letting her tend to him without protest. Her fingers worked quickly, wrapping the bandage around his arm with practiced ease, but she was painfully aware of how close they were. The air between them was too warm, despite the cold. She could feel every breath he took, feel the weight of his gaze on her like a tangible thing. Her own breathing slowed, a fraction too deep. And then, a mistake. She glanced up, and Callum was already watching her. For a second, neither of them moved. His blue eyes flickered, scanning her face, lingering on her lips for half a heartbeat longer than necessary. Her fingers froze where they rested against his arm. A slow inhale, a shift in his posture. The tension between them had been simmering for days, but now it was suffocating. Her gaze dropped. A mistake. Because she had made the worst possible choice she could make in that moment. She looked at his lips. And he noticed. His breath hitched just slightly. A hesitation so small it would have been imperceptible to anyone else. But she was not anyone else. Her heart slammed against her ribs, the realization crashing over her like the storm outside. If she leaned in, just a little, if he did. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to pull back. The moment shattered. She finished tying the bandage, yanking it perhaps a little too tight, and stood up abruptly. "You'll live." Callum exhaled, his smirk returning, but his eyes were still dark with something else, something unspoken. "Good to know," he murmured. Zyra turned her back to him before she could do something reckless. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cave it was too quiet, too heavy. She clenched her fists, inhaling slowly. She had faced war, she had fought beasts 3 times her size, she had never backed down from a battle. And yet, this was a fight she wasn't sure she could win. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with moisture, heavy with the scent of damp earth and vegetation. The jungle around them dripped with lingering rain, mist curling between the trees like spectral fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a predator let out a low, guttural call. Neither a warning nor a challenge, just a reminder that Severus was alive and watching. Zyra should have been focused on that, on the mission, on the dangers still lurking around them, but her mind was elsewhere. Her mind was on him. She hadn't slept, not really, not with Callum so close. The tension between them had stretched too thin, too tight after what had happened in the cave. She had felt the heat of his skin beneath her fingers, had caught the moment his gaze dipped to her lips, had felt the way her own body wanted to close that distance. It had taken everything in her to step away, to act like nothing had changed. But it had. And now, as she led them deeper into the jungle, she hated how aware she was of him. Of his footsteps behind her, of his steady breathing, of the way her pulse reacted every time he got too close. This was dangerous. Not just because of what it meant for her, for them, but because distractions got warriors killed. She needed to push it aside. She needed to lock it down. But then the trap was sprung. 1 second everything was silent, the next the jungle exploded with movement. Zyra barely had time to react before the ground beneath her shattered, a metal snare snapping tight around her ankle, yanking her off her feet. She twisted midair, reaching for her dagger, but it was too late. The force of the trap sent her flying, slamming her into a thick, gnarled tree before she collapsed onto the muddy ground with a sharp exhale. Pain shot through her ribs. Callum was already moving. She heard him before she saw him, his boots pounding against the wet earth, the sound of his blade slicing through the air. A gunshot rang out, a sharp, controlled burst, and something screamed in the distance. Not an animal. Something worse. Her vision swam, but she forced herself up, pushing through the pain. When her eyes cleared, she saw them. Mercenaries, at least 5, armed, armored, moving with the kind of precision that came from experience. Callum was between them and her, a blade in one hand, a gun in the other, his stance unshakable. Zyra swore, forcing herself to her feet despite the sharp pull in her side. "You're in my way, human." Callum didn't look back. "Yeah? You're welcome." She growled but didn't argue. Not now. The mercenaries spread out, their weapons humming with energy, their eyes sharp. They weren't Zerithian, not human either. A mix of species, scars, and blood money. A bounty then. Oh. The realization sent a cold wave through her. They weren't here by chance. They were here for Callum. One of the mercenaries, a tall reptilian brute, stepped forward, his sharp teeth glinting in the dim jungle light. "You've been real hard to track, human," he said, voice thick with amusement. "But lucky us, we caught you right where we wanted." Callum rolled his shoulders, cocking his head. "That's so." Zyra's grip tightened on her blade. They had been hunting him, and he hadn't told her. A sharp flicker of betrayal cut through her, but she shoved it aside. Now wasn't the time. The mercenary leader grinned. "The bounty on you is big enough to retire on, human. You come quietly, we don't have to carve you up too bad." Callum exhaled. Tempting offer. Then, before the mercenary could react, Callum moved. He was too fast. 1 second he was standing still, the next he had closed the distance between them, his blade sinking deep into the reptilian's throat. The jungle erupted into chaos. Gunfire. Clashing steel. The sharp scent of burned ozone as energy blades met resistance. Zyra was in it instantly, her body moving on instinct, dodging the first strike that came her way before driving her dagger up beneath a mercenary's ribs. A wet gurgle, a body hitting the ground. 2 left. Callum had already taken one down, his movements brutal, efficient. He was fighting with everything he had, like he knew there was no room for hesitation, like he knew what would happen if he lost. The last mercenary tried to run. Zyra didn't let him. She caught him mid-turn, slamming him into a tree, her blade at his throat. His breath came fast, panicked. "Wait, wait!" She bared her teeth. "Who sent you?" The mercenary swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Callum, then back to her. He hesitated. She pressed the knife deeper. "Answer." His voice shook. "The Zorithian High Command." The world stopped. Zyra's grip tightened. "You're lying." The mercenary laughed, a sharp, breathless sound. "You think so? You think your people don't know what he is?" His eyes flicked toward Callum. "He's a threat, a problem they don't want to deal with." Zyra didn't move, didn't breathe. Callum met her gaze across the clearing. He didn't say a word. He didn't deny it. Her chest tightened. Then, without breaking eye contact, she drove her blade into the mercenary's throat. The body hit the ground with a dull thud. Silence fell over the jungle. Callum exhaled slowly, wiping blood from his blade. "Well," he muttered, "that was fun." Zyra turned on him so fast he didn't have time to react. She shoved him hard, slamming him against the nearest tree. "How long?" she snarled. Callum didn't fight back, didn't push her off. He just stared at her, rain dripping from his jaw, his breath steady. "You knew," she said, voice shaking with anger. "You knew they were hunting you." His jaw clenched. "Yeah." Zyra's grip tightened around the front of his shirt. "And you didn't think to tell me?" Callum's eyes didn't waver. Would it have changed anything? The worst part was that she didn't know. Her heart was slamming against her ribs, her mind racing. She had started to trust him, had started to see him as something more than an outsider. And now she wasn't sure what he was at all. For the first time since meeting him, she wasn't sure if she should let him go. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. The jungle had never been silent, not truly. Even in its stillest moments, there was the distant hum of life, the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the canopy. But now, as Zyra stood in the aftermath of battle, staring into Callum's unwavering blue eyes, it felt like the entire world had gone quiet. She still felt the heat of the fight in her blood, the tension coiled in her muscles, the echoes of adrenaline that hadn't yet faded. But there was something else now, something deeper, something dangerous. It had been growing between them for days, simmering beneath every glance, every touch, every unspoken word, and now there was nothing left to hold it back. Zyra exhaled sharply, releasing the grip she still had on Callum's shirt. She should have stepped away, should have put distance between them before she did something reckless. And she didn't. Neither did he. Instead, Callum reached for her, slow but certain, fingers grazing her waist, the touch so light it almost wasn't there at all. But she felt it. Gods, she felt it. The warmth of him. The strength in his hands, rough with scars, steady even after all they'd been through. She didn't stop him when he pulled her closer. Didn't stop herself when she lifted a hand to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palm. Steady, strong, real. "You should hate me," she murmured, her voice barely above a breath. Callum's lips twitched in something wry and knowing. "I tried." Zira huffed a quiet laugh, her fingers curling against him, gripping him like an anchor. His hand slid up, fingers tracing along her jaw, his thumb brushing the edge of her bottom lip. She shouldn't have let him touch her like that, but instead of pulling away, she leaned into it. And she didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was her, maybe it was him. All she knew was that suddenly his lips were on hers, fierce, demanding, claiming. Zyra inhaled sharply, her body tensing, not out of hesitation, but because it felt too good. Callum's hands tightened on her hips, pulling her flush against him, and she let out a sound that was half a gasp, half a growl. She kissed him harder, pressing into the heat of him, into the sheer solidness of his body. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking. She was feeling. Callum groaned against her mouth, the sound vibrating through her as she pushed him back against a nearby tree, trapping him between her and the rough bark. He didn't fight it. Didn't fight her. Instead, his fingers traced down her spine, settling at the base of her back, pressing her closer until there was nothing between them but heat and breath and the aching need that had been building for far too long. Zyra had always been in control of herself, of every fight, every decision. But right now, she felt wild. She wanted, and it was him she wanted. She dragged her lips from his, her breath uneven as she pressed her forehead against his, golden eyes burning into blue. Callum swallowed hard, his fingers flexing against her hips. "You're going to ruin me, aren't you?" Zyra smirked, shifting so that her body pinned him completely, her thighs bracketing his. She leaned in, letting her lips ghost over his ear. "I already have." His breath hitched, and then he was kissing her again, harder this time, like he had decided that if she was going to ruin him, he'd let her. Zyra growled into it, threading her fingers into his damp hair, tugging just enough to hear him groan. She reveled in the sound, in the way his hands roamed her body, mapping her like he was learning her. She wanted to devour him. And Callum wanted to let her. She dragged her lips down the column of his throat, nipping at the skin just enough to make him shudder beneath her. His hands tightened, nails pressing just enough into her skin to send a delicious thrill down her spine. The way he reacted to her, raw, unfiltered, completely undone, made something tighten low in her stomach. She had never felt like this, never let herself want like this. But God she wanted, and Callum was hers to take. Zyra pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, their breaths mingling in the humid jungle air. His pupils were blown wide, his lips kiss-bruised, his entire body coiled with tension. But he was waiting for her, for permission. Something inside her cracked. Because no one had ever waited for her before. No one had ever let her set the pace, had ever let her take control, not because they were afraid of her, but because they wanted her to want it. She did, more than she had ever wanted anything. Her fingers trailed down his chest, slow, deliberate, teasing. "Callum," she murmured, just his name, but it sent a visible shiver through him. She liked that. She liked knowing she could make him fall apart with just a touch, just a look. His hand skimmed up her thighs, his grip firm but not demanding, a silent promise that he would follow wherever she led. Zyro leaned in one last time, lips barely brushing his, as she whispered, "Then let me ruin you." And he let her. What followed was not rushed. It was slow, reverent, aching. It was everything she hadn't known she could have. And when it was over, when she lay curled against him, skin slick with sweat, pulse finally steadying, she realized something that terrified her more than any battle ever had. She wasn't just claiming him. She was letting him claim her. Zira shifted, resting a hand over his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. Callum exhaled, his arm tightening around her waist, pulling her closer. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. She had never known what that meant before. Now she did. Callum pressed a lazy kiss to the top of her head, his voice rough with exhaustion and something softer, something she wasn't ready to name. "So," he murmured, "I guess running isn't an option anymore, huh?" Zyra smirked against his skin, her fingers tracing idle patterns along his chest. "No. You're mine now." His chuckle was warm, his grip tightening. "Yeah, I figured." She closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the feeling of him, of this, of everything they had just become. The war wasn't over, but this was the first battle she had ever truly won. The air on Siverus was different after the battle, quieter, as if the jungle itself was waiting to see what they would do next. The storm had long since passed, leaving the ground damp beneath their boots, the scent of rain still lingering in the air. Zyra sat perched on a fallen log, methodically sharpening her blade, though her mind was far from the task. Across from her, Callum stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, his gaze distant as he stared into the trees. The bodies of the mercenaries had already been disposed of, their threat eliminated. But the real enemy? The real enemy was still waiting for them beyond this jungle. She had known since the moment the mercenaries had spoken, since she had looked Callum in the eye and seen the truth written there, that her world was never going to be the same again. The Zerithian High Command had ordered his execution. And she was supposed to be on their side. Zyra had spent her entire life believing in her people, in their laws, in the strength of their warriors. But now, sitting here feeling the ghost of Callum's hands on her skin, the warmth of him still lingering beneath her ribs, she knew. She could not go back to who she was before. Callum turned, his gaze settling on her. His expression was unreadable, but she knew what he was about to say before he spoke. "I can't stay here," he said, voice steady. "More will come." She knew he was right. The High Command wouldn't let this go. They had underestimated him once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Zyra set her blade down, flexing her fingers over her knee. "Where will you go?" His lips quirked, but there was no humor behind it. "Haven't thought that far ahead." A pause, a breath. Then, softly, he said, "Come with me." Her chest tightened. Zyra had not hesitated in battle. Not when she had faced the Aevir, not when she had stood against the mercenaries, not even when she had made the choice to let him live. But this was a different kind of choice. Leaving meant turning her back on everything she had ever known. It meant betraying the laws she had been raised to uphold. It meant becoming a traitor to her own people. But staying meant betraying him, and that was something she could not do. Callum watched her carefully, waiting. He wasn't begging, he would never do that, but she could see the hope in his eyes, buried beneath layers of restraint. He wouldn't ask again. Zyra inhaled slowly, letting the breath settle in her chest. Then she stood. Callum stiffened, as if bracing himself for the answer he didn't want to hear. She stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the quiet war waging behind his eyes. Then, finally, she spoke. "I am not leaving my people," she said, watching as something flickered in his expression. "But I am not staying to watch them destroy you." Callum exhaled, something shifting in his stance, the weight in his shoulders easing just slightly. A slow smile tugged at his lips. That almost sounded like a yes. Zyra smirked. "Almost." She lifted a hand, pressing it to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "I will not run," she said, "but I will fight." Callum covered her hand with his, fingers curling around hers. Solid. Certain. He didn't ask if she was sure. He already knew. Together they turned toward the jungle's edge, where the dense trees gave way to open sky, to whatever waited for them beyond Severus. They had no plan, no guarantees, only a choice, only each other. And for the first time in her life, Zyra wasn't afraid, because she was exactly where she was meant to be.